Hello, lovelies. You're listening to episode 66 of the Broken Enchantments podcast, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. That's me. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Be sure to check out my Patreon for next week's episode, now available. You can check out the links below. Happy listening. They found it. Lying below them, about a mile from the foot of the waterfall, sat Tarkov. The temple was planted in the center of the river's steep gorge, with a bridge to one of the riverbanks. The temple more resembled a palace for all its sweeping arches and soaring spires, though marked with signs of age. Moss bristled over the lower portion of the temple, the portion closest to the water. A collection of old tunnels pierced the temple's base. It looked that they hadn't been used in many, many years. Colorful banners fluttered above the spires and bright silk curtains blew in the balconies. All in all, Janir had to admit it was beautiful. Power glinted from the temple. Janir could feel it webbed deep within the stones and walls. Even from this distance, she could sense a cloud of magic that hung over the place like a fog. Karail yelped as the Soul Seeker popped. He dropped it as it began cracking. "Damn it!" "It must be reacting to the magic in there," Janir mused, pointing to the temple. "Is there a great deal of it?" Velasquez asked. "Yes." Janir nodded. "I can't tell much else from this distance, but yes." Velasquez grimaced and looked to Armandius. "Well?" Karail sighed, blinking down at the sparking device. "Now what?" Their large party waited beside the thundering brink of the waterfall. The dense rainforest hid them from any scouring eyes that might come their direction. Luana breathed a deep sigh. "Should we approach now, or wait until morning?" Janir glanced to the west. The sun should be caressing the horizon within an hour or two. "I say we wait until morning," Armandius put in. "Magic or not, it makes no difference." "I agree," Velasquez added. "Best we stay hidden until we can scout. Then go back for the men." "Luana and I can see to that while you seek a hidden campsite," Seovan offered. Armandius refused to look at Seovan. It seemed that Janir and Karail had no say in what they did, but neither of them cared. Like her friend, Janir was perfectly content to allow others to direct them, at least for now. "We should all find a meeting point before separating." Luana glanced over her shoulder, peering through the thick underbrush with her elven eyes. "It appears to level back that way. We can find a ridge, where the smoke from our fire will not be seen." They reached a consensus and remounted to find a suitable campsite. It was a relief for Janir to be in a saddle once again. She felt a small twinge of guilt that Kalbo had to carry her over the unstable terrain. Biting insects buzzed around her head, and she swatted at them mechanically, having grown accustomed over the past few days. Janir wished she could be back. Where? Did she feel homesick for Brevia, the place she grew up but couldn't remember? Or was it Adasha she longed for? Adasha was where she had been born, after all. It was the citadel of her people, even if she had been taken there last time by force. Armandius led their column through the twisted trees, his normally erect figure sagging with exhaustion. They were all bone-weary, sore. His dappled gray stallion pushed through a line of trees, and, to Janir's surprise, the horses and riders came onto a well-trodden road that snaked down toward the temple. If they had simply followed that earlier instead of circling back to find a campsite, they would have been here long ago. They were about to continue on across the road and into the tangle of greenery on the other side, when a blur of motion and a splash of color caught Janir's eye. Armandius reined in his horse to a halt as they found themselves faced by more than a dozen brightly arrayed, armed temple guards. The guards were mounted on light-boned, prancing steeds. The animals were as fresh as their riders. Any attempt to flee would be a fool's effort. Most of the men carried spears, save for a handful of archers. Janir's heart throbbed, her hands magnetized toward the carcatan at her waist. Seovan, on his mare, moved to angle himself in between Janir and the armed newcomers. The Argatalam did much the same thing with Karail. "I say," one of the guards, presumably the captain, shouted. "Are you bound for Tarkoth?" His voice had a heavy accent, one that Janir had heard before, in Adasha from a certain enslaved healer. Velasquez and Luana both looked to Armandius. Armandius drew a deep breath and straightened in his saddle. "Are you pilgrims?" the captain asked. Armandius shook his head. "No. We are meeting a friend of ours here." "All the same, there is no need for you to sleep in the rainforest like animals." The captain's tone was cordial, as hospitable as Tarkoth was rumored to be. "The high priest will gladly welcome you tonight." "We would not wish to impose upon the hospitality of the high priest longer than we must," Armandius replied. "That is of no consequence. You may lodge with us as long as it takes for your friend to arrive, and longer if need be." Armandius's jaw clenched ever so slightly. The captain signaled to his men. Horses and men rimmed them in from all sides in a heartbeat. Kalbo balked, whickering. Luana drew her swords part way before Velasquez shook his head. Seovan and Karail steered their horses closer to Janir. Her heart sped and she braced herself. "Please," the captain jovially pressed, "accompany us to the temple. I insist." Janir's hands tightened on Kalbo's reins. There was no way Armandius could get out of this. The 6 of them were far too tired to be a match for 3 times as many guards. Armandius must have reached that same conclusion. "There is no way for us to refuse, is there?" The High Lord's right hand loosened from around his sword. Before Janir was quite sure what was happening, they were headed for Tarkoth, surrounded by temple guards. She kept Kalbo close to Karail's stocky pony, and tried to stay as far as possible from the spear-wielding stranger to her left. The road cut through the enmeshed landscape of the Tathansian wild, leaving a comparatively clear path to the temple's gates. There were a few places where wagon wheels and rain had ground ditches in the broad dirt path. But it was still easy going when compared to the net of greenery they had been traversing for days now. Janir avoided making eye contact with the members of their escort. To her, they were but shadows in her peripheral vision. It wasn't coincidence a dozen temple guards happened to be outside the temple at random. Zamarza must already be at Tarkoth and have been aware of their approach. But so long as it was just Zamarza, they would be fine. So long as the enchantress only had a few dozen men and no, or at least not many, Argatalams. They neared the temple, the horses' hooves clomping over the drawbridge connecting it to the shore. Below them, the river raced past, its vibrations rattling up the stonework. The air was thick with enchantments. Old and worn enchantments mingled with auras of new ones. This was a place of power and had been for a very long time. The captain led them through the temple gates. The gate was flanked by statues of Lilam and Lilona, the twin essences of the sky and sea. They were portrayed as a boyish youth and a demure maiden, their carved hands clasping over the gate's arch. Lilam wore a loincloth of clouds, and Lilona's slim figure was garbed in a gown of seaweed, her tangled hair giving way to sea foam. The sculptures seemed so innocent, so benign. Green moss blanketed the statues, and the sculpture was worn away in places, attesting to their age. As their group neared, the flicker of magic beckoned to Janir from ahead. At first it seemed nothing. Then she caught the metallic sheen of Argatalam power. She looked frantically to Armandius and Seovan, but while Seovan noticed her fraught gesturing, there was nothing they could do. Janir crunched her tongue between her teeth. They were caught. Before they had even begun, they were caught. They were escorted into a courtyard enclosed by walls with flowering vines snaking up over most of the stones, only parting around windows. Dirty children peered at them from behind barrels and haystacks at one end, while a few women in bright saris watched from the upper windows. Janir swallowed and stared straight ahead to a broad staircase between two buildings. Descending, there came a man clad in the heavy robes of a high priest, a large medallion thumping his chest with each step. His weathered skin had begun to hang on his bones, and the veins on his hands were bumpy ridges. His mouth crinkled into a welcoming smile behind his neatly trimmed beard, streaked with gray. Clenching Kalbo's reins, Janir apprehensively awaited the priest's approach. His magic flared powerfully, perhaps even more powerful than Zamarza. The man stopped and affably motioned for them to dismount. Armandius was the first to dismount, and the rest of their group followed suit. Janir couldn't imagine why he was so calm. He must know it was a trap. No sooner had Janir and the others dismounted than stable hands rushed forward from seemingly nowhere to take their horses. Janir reluctantly acquiesced, glad that she hadn't placed her carcotton in the saddlebags. Their group tried not to bunch together. They would appear as though they were on the defensive. Even if they were, that was not how they wished to appear to their host, or their captor. So though Janir wished she could be closer to Seovan, she had to content herself with letting him stand on Armandius's left, whilst the High Lord angled himself between her and the priest. Carlisle stood at her side, closer than all the others. Janir reminded herself of the stories Carlisle had told her, about the things they had done, about the trials they had survived. If they could endure shipwrecks, Mazag griffins, and being held captive by Argotolums, they could definitely survive whatever this was. Or at least, that was what she hoped. "My children," the high priest began. His voice was cordial and kind, if a little raspy with age. "I am Jorman Nufar, high priest of Tarkoth." Janir clenched Carlisle's sleeve. The enchanter glanced to her quizzically. Since they might be overheard, she gave him only a wry grimace. Carlisle's brow wrinkled, but Jorman was soon speaking again. "High priest." Velasquez frowned. "Were you expecting us?" Jorman laughed, a raspy, throaty sound. "Little happens in these rainforests that I do not expect, son of Esmond." Velasquez's lips thinned. Janir might not have noticed if she hadn't been standing so close. Tiptoeing as near as she dared, Janir whispered behind Armandius. "Argotolums," she croaked, throat constricting. The High Lord's fists closed, but he didn't move. An instant later, their group was ringed by a gauntlet of at least 30 Mortons and Mortanas. Their escape was cut off. Their horses were gone. They were drastically outnumbered. They were ensnared as surely as partridges. "I knew it was a trap," Carlisle remarked, rather lightly considering their circumstances. "Did anyone else know it was a trap?" You have been listening to Broken Enchantments, written and read by Elizabeth Wheatley. Don't forget to check out my Patreon for early access to episodes, bonus content, and lots of patrons-only freebies. You can learn more at elizabethwheatley.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube. I'll see you next time.